Dinner, with its delicate precision and well-drilled attentions, eased itself into coffee and the minor freedom that follows. Lady Honoria contrived, without acknowledging the mechanics, to nudge the company back toward the conservatory. It was part of the spectacle that the roses should have their encore. Lamps were lowered a shade. The small orchestra in the library, now no more than a courteous murmur, sent a waltz through the doorways as if to show it knew its place. The air held the mild confectioner's scent of starch and clove. Sir Julian, whose sense of audience did not vanish when plates did, recited a scrap of Herrick with a liquid melancholy that made one feel the verse had been written to flatter him. The brigadier corrected him amiably on the date, and then, remembering himself, repented. Helena Etheridge, light-catching and conscious of it, was persuaded to cross the room for a closer look at the white roses, and went with that careful enthusiasm which young ladies cultivate for grown persons' passions. Mr. Vale kept half an eye on his central bouquet, and half on Crispin Dallow, who, pen uncapped, was making small private marks upon a stiff card. Alleyn, who had been sent a very decent coffee by the precise hand of Ellison, stood with Troy in that comfortable proximity which requires no arrangement, both watching without conspicuousness. It was Troy who noticed the window, where the catch Ellison had settled earlier seemed to have shifted a fraction. A draught insinuated itself, turned a rose petal by a hair's breadth, and made a paper leaf give the faintest, crisp response. Somewhere in the lot a ribbon tip lifted, showed its pale underside, and sank. "Your paper breathes," Troy said, not unkindly to Mr. Vale as he passed. He smiled, distracted. "It will do that," he said, and went on in the direction of Lady Honoria, who was about to perform an introduction between Helena and Sir Julian that both might remember for reasons of their own. Crispin Dallow drifted, almost idly, toward the plinth. He had that absent air, frequent in his tribe, which may denote savage concentration or merely the rehearsal of withering phrases. He put his card upon the edge of the plinth where the bone folder was laid, and stood with his head very slightly bowed, looking, it would seem, at the disobedient ribbon. His free hand explored his lapel for the spring of a fountain pen. He had a way of half smiling when he caught himself at a private joke. It touched his face then and went. Miss Pike, appearing for an instant beside Alleyn like a ghost with an inventory, spoke to Ellison in a low tone about more cups. Ellison returned to his equilibrium and passed on. A brush in the paste dish, dislodged by someone's sleeve, made a quiet tap against its companion and resumed its cross. When the moment came, it was not, in the least, theatrical. It unfolded as a small change in the room's rhythm. The waltz from the library breathed, paused, delicately for a turn, and came again. Sir Julian accepted Lady Honoria's applause with that slight inclination which is gratitude without debt. The brigadier chuckled under his breath at a memory of white camellias and cavalry, and Helena, bending to count petals in a manner perhaps suggested at school, looked up and said, very softly, but with a curiosity that carried, "Mr. Dallow." He had sat, one could not say when, on the cane chair that someone had provided because it looked domestic beside art. His head was tipped back by an angle that might, at first, be mere thought. The hand that had explored his lapel lay open on the armrest, palm up, fingers relaxed in a way so graceful that one was ashamed, for a second, to suspect it. The card with his small marks had slid, not far, to a stop against the bone folder. A paper petal had come away from the bouquet, no more than a flirt of white, and lodged lightly against the cuff of his sleeve. The lamplight made a small coin on the rim of his coffee cup standing at his elbow. Lady Honoria said, "Crispin," as one says it when one recommends a friend to be witty. Sir Julian began a remark, which, being unnecessary, he did not finish. Mr. Vale, coming forward, stopped with an odd economy. Troy touched Alleyn's arm. Alleyn crossed the small interval without appearance of a haste. The room, like a child in a doorway, held itself. He stood where he could look first and then act, and, because he was who he was, looked a heartbeat longer than most men would have done. He put 2 fingers with the gentlest of pressures where the wrist shows its secret. He counted nothing. He set down the hand with something that was not quite a caress and turned the coffee cup a fraction without purpose. "Lady Honoria," he said, and his voice was what it always was when everyone must hear and no one be alarmed. "Would you be so good as to ask Ellison to telephone for a doctor?" The paper rose against Crispin Dallow's cuff, did not stir. The draft declined and the ribbon lay. The waltz tidied itself away at the end of the phrase. In the tiny interval before movement returned, the company found themselves, as one does sometimes in drawing rooms and sometimes in dreams, obliged to look at a fact that had happened without making any sound. It was in Alleyn's nature to let the room present itself before he imposed upon it. He stood very still beside the delicate chair and let his eyes travel, not yet his hands. Dallow's posture, so composed, had the quiet indecency of sleep in company. The coffee cup on the small table to his right had left a faint ring. A single drop trembled at the rim, undecided. The fountain pen lay across his palm, uncapped, its nib pointing toward a folded program on which no word had been written. The lamplight, intent upon doing the right thing, limned the features and made of Dallow's pallor an effect. Lady Honoria was perfectly upright and perfectly white. "Ellison," she said, and her voice was obedient to her. "Telephone Dr. Penfold at once, and, yes, the police." She glanced once mechanically at Alleyn. "If you would be so very kind." "Ellison will do," Alleyn said gently. "And perhaps, Lady Honoria, we could keep everyone together for a moment. It's a great deal easier for doctors and policemen if nothing is moved." She nodded, remote. Her niece gave a small sound and put her fingers to her throat. Sir Julian, with an almost exaggerated restraint, removed the coffee cup nearest to Helena and set it prudently on a different table, as if to spare her the association. The brigadier shifted his weight, prepared by habit to take charge of the unmilitary, and then, as if recollecting himself, put his hands behind his back and stared at a tassel. Miss Pike had already moved, without fuss, to the threshold. "Ellison," she said softly when he returned, "Dr. Penfold is on his way. Mr. Burnaby at the station says Inspector Fox will telephone." She looked at Alleyn and made the smallest inclination, as if acknowledging that the world had altered and he knew the new steps. Alleyn, bending now, placed 2 fingers lightly at Dallow's wrist. The skin was cool. Close to, there was nothing violent in the face, nothing that suggested a struggle. The mouth had settled, not slackly, but without intention. A faint moisture showed at one corner, and on the lower lip a minute, almost ludicrously neat patch of color that the lamplight encouraged into life. He did not touch it. He straightened and let the air inform him. It had the clove and starch ghost of the paper roses and the less distinct odor of a room that had been worked in, paste, perhaps, and the clean, papery breath of cut stock. Somewhere a draught found the trellis and worried a petal so that it gave a small, shivering sound. On the linen beneath the central bouquet, a real petal from the authentic rose had fallen and made an oval of bruised vermilion. Another hung, considering. "Shall I draw the curtains?" Sir Julian asked, on an actor's pitch of under-offer. "If you please, not just yet," Alleyn said. "The light is very good as it is." He took out his handkerchief, lifted the program by a corner, and saw the clean, untouched surface. The pen had left a comma of ink where it had lain and then dried to a dull grain. On the saucer, near Dallow's cup, the tiniest irregular fleck adhered, like a chip from a white petal. He noticed it and let it rest. Mr. Vale, who had kept himself back with an effort that showed in the angle of his head, said suddenly, he was speaking of verisimilitude, of how the real thing— He stopped. "I beg your pardon." "There is no need," Lady Honoria said, not unkindly. "We shall sit in the drawing-room." She looked to Alleyn. Unless, if you could give me 5 minutes, Alleyn said, and perhaps ask Ellison to keep the staff from tidying. It is such a temptation. Miss Pike's pencil made a discreet appearance above her cuff. I'll see to it. He did not much like touching the cup, but did so with the handkerchief, enough to confirm the warmth. The coffee's surface trembled at his intervention and settled again, unhelpfully. He brought it near enough, without inhaling with intention. Nothing declared itself more than coffee does. He set the cup down precisely where it had been. At the plinth, the tools of the paper rose trade lay with their posed candor. Shears, bone folder, paste, a spool of wire, a little file. One of the brushes bore, at its tip, a faintly darkened crescent. The paste had acquired that thin, accidental skin. The real rose's ribbon had slipped imperceptibly to one side, as if the weight at its heart had altered. "Inspector," the brigadier said, in a voice that did not belong to this room, "is there anything we can do?" "Yes," Alleyn said. "Forgive me if I make a nuisance of myself. If each of you would remain together and use no more coffee and touch as little as possible, you will be doing a very great deal." He glanced at the window Ellison had set earlier. The catch, he thought, was a trifle wider now. A whisper of night entered, cool and demanding. Ellison returned. "Dr. Penfold is within 10 minutes, sir." "Thank you." Alleyn stood once more and let the scene be what it was. An arrangement, very careful, that had suffered a single, decisive alteration. He thought, not unkindly, that Dallow would have recognized the composition and found words for it. He preferred, for the moment, to leave it wordless. Alleyn began with the smallest disturbance to the social fabric. He invited Sir Julian to the little anteroom that opened off the drawing-room, a space with 2 chairs and a chinoiserie screen on which ladies in pink satin forever crossed a bridge. Fox took up a position within earshot and beyond embarrassment. "My dear Inspector," Sir Julian said, settling as if for an interview with a sympathetic producer, "these occasions throw odd shadows. One almost expects the prompter to whisper." "Your recollection will serve well enough," Alleyn returned. "After coffee, your movements?" Harmlessly theatrical. Sir Julian smiled. I toyed with the port, refused the coffee, caffeine is a traitor to the voice, and stepped into the green baize passage to telephone my dresser about a cufflink. It took 2 minutes. One keeps a repertory of trivialities. "You didn't return to the conservatory." I drifted to its threshold. Dallow was in residence, composing his next bolt of Olympian lightning, no doubt. I decided not to tempt it. I confess I found the roses oppressive. Too good an imitation can be cruel. Alleyn thanked him and asked for the brigadier, who arrived with a compressed air of usefulness. "Beastly business," said Sir Lionel. "Man goes off like a light. Always disliked the fellow's manner. Acid on a wound, but damn bad show." He sat bolt upright. "Where was I? Between rooms. I loitered by the decanter. No coffee. We old soldiers sleep light, and not at all if we flirt with Arabica." "You saw Mr. Dallow in the conservatory." Head back as if rehearsing his own epitaph, the brigadier said grimly. Miss Pike adjusted a lamp. Vale fidgeted near his contrivances. The niece flitted in and out. That is all. "Did you notice the coffee service?" "Trim as a parade. Ellison knows his drill." Helena entered like a swallow, all nervous grace. She sat when asked and kept her hands very still in her lap. "Miss Etheridge," Alleyn said, and his voice softened by a degree. "You raised the alarm." "I thought he was asleep at first," she whispered. "Then I saw his hand. It had stopped being a hand. I don't know how else to put it." She swallowed. "I only went in to fetch my scarf. The conservatory is chilly." "You carried coffee?" "No, I dislike it. Aunt Honoria says that will change." A brief, dutiful smile. Mr. Dallow asked Ellison for a second cup. He said the first was too coy. He used that word. He preferred it stronger. You are quite sure? Yes, thank you. He let her go with a kindness that steadied her. Her perfume, faint as breath on a mirror, lingered after. Mr. Peregrine Vale presented himself with a craftsman's self-effacement. He folded his long fingers and kept his eyes lowered, as if they might damage the air by looking too directly. Mr. Dallow was harsh? Alleyn inquired. He was precise, Vale said. He used the word theatrical. I agreed with him about the red. It is difficult to resist red. One makes a compromise, one regrets. He lifted his eyes at last. I said I would alter the central ribbon. I did so. That is all. When? After dinner. 10 minutes before Miss Etheridge returned. Miss Pike asked me not to litter the cloth. His mouth attempted a smile and failed. She is excellent. You did not touch the coffee. I take tea, he said simply, as if confessing a limitation. I remember the scent, though, an odd sweetness. Paper holds odors strangely. It keeps them. It does not forgive. Lady Honoria came last. She did not sit. Her control had contracted into a kind of cool charity. This is hateful, she said, and must be dealt with quietly. You will wish to know the routine. We serve coffee in the conservatory when we exhibit. It keeps the laggards from the library. Ellison pours. Miss Pike sees to cups. Guests help themselves to sugar from the silver bowl. Mr. Dallow usually took it black. I heard him ask for it stronger, which seemed in character. You noticed who attended him? Helena hovered. Mr. Vale hovered differently. Sir Julian avoided. The brigadier planted himself in the doorway, like a sentry. I'm afraid that is all. When she had gone, the shifting silence of a house on guard returned. In the conservatory, the tools lay in their neat array. A dull glint on the shear's pivot suggested a recent wipe. A petal, loosened past endurance, slipped from the living rose and fell without sound onto the white cloth, where a faint brown ring marked the place a cup had rested and been removed. Ellison passed the open door with the exact discretion of a well-trained ghost. He had the look of a man who could answer a list of questions in the order they were asked, and not one besides. Miss Pike, at the writing table, was transposing names from a guest list to a card, as if accuracy might repair equilibrium. The pencil in her cuff made a small, involuntary movement each time the conservatory was mentioned. The household, Alleyn said to Fox, if you please. Gently. Fox nodded and went away as if he had only remembered a message. Alleyn remained, listening to the faintest whisper of paper as the roses settled in the lamplight. Somewhere, a maid closed a door with the carefulness of someone accustomed to the difference between sounds that pass and sounds that carry. Alleyn asked for a small room. Lady Honoria, understanding the etiquette of misfortune, gave him the library. It was the sort of room that preserves confidences, leather that had acquired a patina of listening, a fire that made a sound like discretion. Fox stationed himself at a small escritoire with his notebook, and the door remained not quite shut, which in such houses signifies privacy without drama. Lady Honoria came first. She took the upright chair as if it were a platform, folded her hands on her lap, and addressed the mantelpiece rather than Alleyn. You will require facts, she said, and produced them with practiced economy. She had invited Dallow because one must be reviewed or one is nothing. He had arrived punctually, had been brisk at dinner, and had taken coffee, 1 cup only. She had noticed, with a hostess's fatal attentiveness, that he declined brandy. I do not suggest significance, she concluded, which, of course, suggested that she did. Did he quarrel? Alleyn asked. We do not quarrel in my house, Lady Honoria said, then relented. There was friction. Mr. Dallow was amused at being placed beside Sir Julian. Actors are not always delighted by critics. The brigadier delivered a small harangue about real roses, which Mr. Dallow found allegorical, and Mr. Vale, poor man, went white in a manner that was almost impolite. Sir Julian followed, an artful figure whose fatigue could have been either genuine or exquisitely rehearsed. He sat half-turned, giving the fire his profile. "We fenced, Inspector," he said. "I make a habit of fencing with Mr. Dallow. He feints, I parry. The audience is entertained. No blood is shed." "You did not like him," Alleyn suggested. "My dear man, liking is a domestic emotion. Mr. Dallow was professionally inevitable." He smoothed an unseen crease. "I took tea, not coffee. I cannot sleep if I drink coffee at night. If you require my cup and saucer, they will be found to have been abused with lemon." "Did you go into the conservatory after dinner?" "For the inevitable admiration. I did not approach Mr. Dallow until Miss Etheridge asked if he were unwell. He did not respond. That was that." Helena Etheridge came in with an air of having rehearsed calm and found the part too large. "I ought to have noticed," she said miserably. "He looked like a statue that had stopped pretending." She answered quietly, with the sort of sincerity that doesn't yet know it can be used as currency. She had seen Mr. Dallow speak to Mr. Vale very softly, and to Miss Pike not at all, though he had looked at her as if she were a typeface he disapproved. He said something about pastiche. He didn't say it to me. I only heard the shape of the word. It is an ugly shape, isn't it? "Where were you when coffee was served?" "In the drawing room. I did not take any. Aunt Honoria says caffeine is fatal to a complexion." Peregrine Vale arrived as if apologizing for the act. He took the edge of the chair rather than the seat. "I don't know how to be helpful," he said. "Mr. Dallow has disliked me on and off for 2 years. He finds my work," was the word sentimental, "and says sentimentality should be taxed." "Did you speak alone with him tonight?" "For a minute. He told me my central idea was not new. As you see, it isn't. Paper and a real rose at the heart. That is an old conceit." He suggested that my sincerity bored him. I apologized. He lifted his hands and let them fall with an air of helpless disclosure. There was paste beneath one nail and a faint glisten on a finger where wire had recently marked a curve. "I put away the shears before dinner," he added, unasked, and hesitated. "I thought I did. Did you drink coffee?" "One, black." It sat untouched while the brigadier demonstrated the superiority of cavalry to paper. Miss Pike entered without sound and sat as if the chair had been pressed flat beneath her. She answered everything precisely and with the care of one who keeps other people's diaries. Place cards, timings, courses, coffee. "Ellison poured," she said. "The footmen carried. I stayed by the door." Her pencil, still in her cuff, made a small, involuntary tap against the fabric. Mr. Dallow's cup had the faintest line. "I saw it at luncheon and had it removed. It was not used tonight." "You notice the cups closely," Alleyn said. "It is my work to notice, Inspector." The brigadier concluded the parade, bringing with him a smell of good leather and club brooms. "Beastly business," he said with comfortable belligerence. He had disliked Dallow on instinct, which he trusted. He had taken brandy and made a point of scorning the roses. "Give me thorns. These things are for ladies," he said with a nod toward the paper blooms that managed to make even that sound insufficient. "You saw nothing else?" Alleyn asked. "Saw a great deal," the brigadier said, "and understood less. The fellow took his coffee and his notes, and then he took his leave of the parade ground. That's all." Alleyn let them go. The fire settled. In the conservatory, a single petal slipped from the real rose and found its place among its paper betters. The house, wrapped in good breeding, held back what it knew. The butler's pantry held its own reserve. Brass polished to a discreet glow, a ledger open at an impeccable hand, keys hanging in orderly formation like a quiet rebuke to accident. The air smelt of beeswax and metal polish, with a fainter note of wine, Merely the ghost of decanters aired and made ready for use. Ellison, who in old photographs in the passage had once been Shrimpton, stood before the silver safe with his hands properly at ease, as if prepared to be examined without, however, volunteering for dissection. Fox took a station by the sideboard with his notebook, his bulk assuming an almost apologetic unobtrusiveness. Alleyn, who understood that service possessed its own armor, kept his tone civilized. "You are responsible for the coffee, Mr. Ellison?" "My department, sir. Yes," Ellison replied. His voice wore neutrality, as another man might wear a perfectly ironed shirt. "Mrs. Brant prepares it. I pour and present. The parlor maid carries." He considered and added, "This evening, Miss Daisy." "Miss Daisy," Alleyn repeated, as if he had been introduced to her at a dance. She was sent for and came, a slim creature with anxious hands, the new cap sitting with the air of having been rebuked into position. She bobbed and, at a look from Ellison that was almost paternal, composed herself. "You took the tray into the conservatory?" "Yes, sir, after coffee in the drawing-room. Her ladyship said some might prefer the plants." Her glance darted, not to Alleyn, but to Ellison, and returned. "Mr. Dallow was there with his cup already. I gave the sugar to the company." Ellison interposed gently. "Daisy means she offered it, sir. It is our custom to offer. Mr. Dallow, if I may say, is particular in his habits." "In what way?" Alleyn asked mildly. A slight pause. Daisy's eyes went to the sugar tongs upon the tray as if the object might supply a script. "Just as he likes it, sir, as he usually—" She stopped, flush rising. "As he usually did not," Ellison said, very composed. "Mr. Dallow's habit was black coffee. He has, on former occasions, declined sugar. I had noted it in the margin, as we do. This evening," his gaze rested implacably on the ledger, "I cannot speak to a change of preference. I was not present." Alleyn let the small ripple die. Who remained in the conservatory in the interval between drawing-room and discovery? Ellison considered the question like a menu. "Mr. Vale and Mrs. Alleyn, sir. At first, Miss Pike crossed and recrossed upon her duties. Sir Julian made a perambulation, if that is the word. He is a gentleman who surveys a room as if listening to it. Miss Helena looked in and withdrew. The brigadier did not come as far as the plants. I believe he disapproves of humidity. Any alterations to the arrangement?" Alleyn's eyes rested briefly on the polish-scented knives and then upon the neat row of cups cooling on the lower shelf. "None sanctioned," Ellison said, with the faintest shadow of emphasis on the verb. Mrs. Brant, who had come to the pantry with the air of a captain entering a wardroom, added her evidence with economy. "Coffee ground fresh, Inspector. From the tin as delivered. I keep the key on my person. I draw water to the mark. The machine is watched. There is nothing irregular in my kitchen." She had hands that could manage heat and crisis. Alleyn thought she would be reliable in a shipwreck. "Quite," he said. "And the cups?" "The spode," she returned unblinkingly. "At Miss Pike's instruction this morning, seeing the hairline in the Sèvres. The spode is sound. You will have noticed the tongs were set out with lump sugar and the caster for those who like it fine. We accommodate a number of preferences, Inspector. It is, if you will pardon me, the essence of service." Daisy had begun to wind the corner of her apron between her fingers. Alleyn turned to her as one might to a nervous animal, without sudden movement. "You set down Mr. Dallow's cup?" "He had it, sir, when I came, on the little table by him. There was the bouquet." She faltered, swallowed. The little brushes had been moved. "I noticed because the paste dish leaves a mark if one is not careful. I wiped it. Mr. Vale is very particular." "You saw someone move the brushes?" Alleyn's voice was a touch lighter than idle curiosity. Daisy looked desperately at Ellison, who examined the ceiling with interest. "A gentleman had been there before the company came through," she said at last, as if threading a needle in a gale. "I could tell by the way the chair was. The little chair, the one with the green braid, it had been drawn closer and then pushed away with a care that isn't ours. And there was a scent. "Of roses?" Alleyn inquired. "No, sir," she said, and coloured for no clear reason. "Almond. Only the flowers do carry all sorts. One tells oneself it is the flowers." Ellison's face remained a masterpiece of respectful opacity. "The conservatory takes on a number of notes in the course of an evening," he observed. "It would be unwise to attribute them." "Unwise," Mrs. Brant agreed, hands folded as if over a seal. Alleyn let it go. Their caution was as unmistakable as their competence, their loyalty administered in measured doses. Yet their careful omissions had been as articulate as any frankness. "Thank you," he said, rising. "You have been very helpful." In the corridor, the old photographs looked on. Sepia servants in stiffer caps, their unreadable eyes set on duties completed. Fox, beside him, shut his notebook with a small private click. "They know something, sir," he murmured. "They always do," Alleyn said. "The trick is to discern whether it is what we need, or merely what they think proper to say." Alleyn asked Lady Honoria's permission to speak with her staff in the butler's pantry. The small square room had the polished serenity of a chapel. Mahogany, brass, a faint odor of beeswax. Ranks of glass and silver watched from their shelves. Ellison, his name sat discreetly on a card above the bell-board, so there was no confusion tonight, waited with hands composed behind him, his face offering that scrupulous neutrality by which a good household lives. "You have had unpleasant experience," Alleyn said gently. "This will be as brief as is proper." "Thank you, sir." Ellison's voice had the dry clarity of a decanter being lifted. He glanced, almost imperceptibly, at the pantry door before proceeding. Coffee was served in the drawing-room at 10 minutes past 10. Spode, pattern Italian. Second service. The Sèvres is not used for coffee. Who carried the tray? "Sims, sir." A footman appeared in the doorway as if summoned by name. Young, anxious, with the thoughtful hands of a man who has learned to smooth linen with his palms. "I poured for Lady Honoria," Ellison continued. "Miss Pike took responsibility for ensuring guests were attended. It is her habit when there is an artistic program." "Did the critic, Mr. Dallow, request anything particular?" "Black coffee, sir." Ellison's eyelids flickered. Not quite a blink. "No sugar. He expressed a preference earlier in the evening." Mrs. Blore, the housekeeper, entered with a guarded rustle. She had a competent face and the weary dignity of one who has long tended other people's perfect rooms. "You'll want the Times," she said, taking command. Tea things cleared at 8:25. Dinner announced at 8:30. Conservatory tidied during the first course. I saw to the cloth beneath the flowers myself. The white cloth on the plinth. Yes, the paste had marked the old one. Mr. Vale prefers a clean field. "Did anyone go in after coffee was announced?" Alleyn asked. Mrs. Blore's eyes steadied. "Guests, sir. I could not say who precisely. They come and go." Ivy, the parlour-maid, produced a curtsy that belonged to an earlier decade. "Beg pardon, sir. I only thought—" Miss Pike was very particular about the ribbon on the bouquet. The blue silk, it had a twist, she corrected. Gentle-like, not interfering. "When was that?" "Before dinner, sir. Then again, after." Ellison's stillness deepened by a fraction. "Miss Pike is conscientious." "Quite," Alleyn said. "Sims?" The footman licked dry lips. "I carried the tray in. Mr. Dallow was by the conservatory doors. Miss Pike said she would see to him. I set the tray on the low table. Ellison poured. He stopped. I stood back. "How long were you in the room?" "Not long, sir. We do not linger." Mrs. Blore produced a tiny sniff that might have been disapproval or grief. "We keep the draught off that room," she said. "The window catch sticks. I ask for it to be left alone. Someone has a fancy for air." Someone? Alleyn repeated. Again tonight, she said, and folded her hands. Ellison added, after a small pause, The conservatory window was set a fraction open when we took coffee in, sir. I closed it. Paper objects do not enjoy weather. Who customarily attends to the coffee sugars? Alleyn asked, and Ivy responded at once. I do, sir. 2 lumps, tongs, spoons at 20 past, handles rightward. Ellison says it looks neatest. Mr. Dallow never takes sugar. Alleyn thanked them and stood. It was not that they lied. It was that loyalty in houses such as these had the texture of protocol. Each had offered him the edges of something, lightly sanded, polished for the occasion. Within those polished edges lay a series of small, careful omissions. A ribbon adjusted again, a window opened again, a cup delivered at one remove. The staff knew, as servants always know, the shape of the evening's deviations. They would not, out of respect, supply the missing center. At the door, Ellison said, almost diffidently, If I may, sir, Mr. Dallow had a way with his pen. People notice such things. He was noticed, Alleyn said. Ellison inclined his head. Yes, sir, and not always in the way they hoped. Alleyn returned to the conservatory with the pantry's scents still in his mind. Beeswax, starch, the ghost of coffee. The paper roses stood in their immaculate deceit. The living bloom had loosened yet another petal. Fox, who had been listening at one remove, gave the barest nod. The house had spoken in its careful language. It remained for him to hear what it had not said. Chapter 6. A clue. Hidden in ritual or routine. Alleyn revisited the conservatory as one returns to a problem in the morning, expecting sense to have settled on it like dust. He stood with hands behind him and saw the room not as it had been admired, but as it had been used. The coffee apparatus had been removed, save for Mr. Dallow's cup and saucer, left by Ellison's discretion precisely where they had stood. The spoon lay upon the saucer with its handle pointing left, bowl down. Ivy's neat little dictum, spoons at 20 past, handles rightward, floated back with the reliability of a metronome. Alleyn did not touch it. He only looked, until looking became knowledge. He crossed to the central plinth. The white cloth beneath the bouquet had been changed that evening. The fold ran right to left, not left to right, and there was the faintest shadow of paste along the new hem where it had learned the weight of tools. The bone folder lay parallel to the edge. When he had first seen it, it had been angled toward the file. The crossed brushes had been crossed again, one atop the other in reversed order. An untidiness disguised as order, like a sheet smoothed in haste and patted to seem correct. He tried the conservatory window. The catch yielded after a delicate, complaining click. A breath of London autumn came shouldering in and made the paper petals quiver with a whisper like silk against silk. He closed it and looked at his fingers, a faint grey smear from the oxidized brass, recently disturbed. If Ellison had closed it at coffee, someone had opened it after. From the drawing room came the subdued murmur of restrained conversation, and, threaded through it, the very particular sound of Miss Pike's voice saying, "If Lady Honoria prefers," which Alleyn thought meant she was arranging something without appearing to arrange it at all. He bent to the floor beside Dallow's chair. A minute curl of blue silk lay there, ribbon, cut so fine that only habit could have produced so narrow a shaving. It had drifted into the fringe of the carpet and been spared the general clearing because it was shy of the light. He left it where it was, marking it with his eye rather than his hand. On the plinth, the real rose had lost yet another petal. The fall of these small red commas had formed a quiet arc on the cloth, and within that arc, very lightly, a different mark interrupted the pattern, a pale crescent where something damp had rested and been taken away. He bent closer. The paper's sizing had grayed a fraction there. Paste? No. Something clearer, that had dried with chastened modesty. A coffee cup might have fitted it if one permitted for the ring to be imperfect. He cast his gaze at the shears. Their pivot, newly bright, had a mere fleck of brown along the screw that had not been there at first viewing. Not rust, not quite. Rather the ghost of liquid dried off in a hurry. He did not, even in thought, write the answer. He wrote the question. Fox's step approached. "Sir, ritual tells on us," Alleyn said. "When we break it, we leave fingerprints of a kind." Fox followed his gaze to the spoon, the brushes, the window catch. "Someone served him who wasn't the someone," Fox murmured. "Perhaps," said Alleyn, "or someone made a picture of the scene and then, not being Ellison, could not resist improving it." He straightened. The bouquet's silk ribbon, blue as a vein beneath skin, had been retied with a minute change of hand. The loop on the left sat forward. A left-handed bow, then, made by a right-handed person, imitating what they had, watched. These were the small, disloyal betrayals of habit. In the doorway, Miss Pike paused with a tray. She did not look at the plinth. She looked just to one side of it, which was more informative. "Lady Honoria wonders if you require anything further, Inspector." "Only time," Alleyn said, "and the kindness of order." "Of course," Miss Pike replied, and went away as quietly as a sigh. He stood a moment longer, listening to the paper roses whisper against their own perfection, and let the room's routine offer up its tiny treacheries. Somewhere within them, the shape of motive was beginning to form, not from what was present, but from what had been rearranged. By 10, the house had adjusted itself to the event as well-bred houses do. A thinning of voices, a gentling of footfalls, doors that closed with thought rather than sound. Dr. Pemberton had gone, promising to arrange the formalities. Fox moved with soft method among statements. Ellison materialized and vanished like a capable ghost. In the conservatory, a further petal had fallen from the single real bloom and lay upon the cloth like a careful accent. Alleyn stood a moment by the long windows. The catch sat in its second notch, not the third as Ellison had set it earlier to compromise between air and art. A trifling alteration, perhaps no more than some guest's fidgeting. Yet the room's small systems had begun to register. Somewhere beyond, a bell sounded, softly, twice. Not the drawing-room bell, which spoke in a neat little chirrup, but the more distant note that belonged to the orangery. Ellison, who was entering with a whisper of decanter, paused and looked surprised. "That bell is seldom used at night, sir," he murmured. "In the spring, for tea among the pots. It should not be rung now." "Thank you," said Alleyn. "We shall see." He made his way along the tiled passage where the air shifted from rosewater to clean damp and citrus. The orangery had a utilitarian elegance, ranks of glossy leaves, pale fruit suspended like modest ornaments, and at the far end a small iron stove where gardeners warmed their hands on frosty mornings. The faintest scent of singed paper lingered, as if something delicate had thought better of itself too late. Helena Etheridge stood by the stove with a pair of brass tongs. Her cheeks were a little flushed. The merest coil of smoke drifted and then resigned itself. She looked up quickly, let the tongs lower, and attempted a smile that had no practice behind it. "I was cold," she said, and glanced guiltily at the stove, where a scrap cindered and sighed. There was an old leaflet, from some charity. It seemed untidy. Alleyn did not move closer at once. He let the air arrange itself. On the grate, a corner of paper still held enough fidelity to show a typed 9-0 and the fragment of a word, rose, with an E that sat minutely higher than its fellows. In the margin, as a faint embossing had survived. H.E. It might have belonged to Helena Etheridge. It might, with equal propriety, have stood for Honoria Etheridge. "Old papers can be obstinate," he said mildly. "Did you by chance?" Ring the bell? She looked at him directly. No, I didn't touch anything. Only that. The tongs made a little clink against the stove's lip. Forgive me, said Miss Pike from the doorway. She carried a small tray with brandy and glasses and had the look of one who attends upon a storm without admitting its existence. Her gaze took in the grate, the tongs, Helena's colour, and then returned, composed, to Alleyn. Her ladyship asked for this. Thank you, he said. The orangery bell, Miss Pike. Was it you? No, Inspector. A fractional pause. I heard it. They stood a heartbeat in a triangle of politeness. Then Miss Pike inclined her head, and Helena put the tongs properly on the stand, and the faint thread of smoke surrendered to the citrus air. When Alleyn returned to the conservatory, Fox met him with a small contained report. Dallow's notebook, sir. The pocket one. It's not among his things. Pen present, program present. No blue pad. Front door. Brigadier at post like a sentry. No departures. Library window latched. I looked. Alleyn thanked him and crossed to the plinth. Peregrine Vale stood there with an intentness that approached defiance. He had a length of white ribbon in his fingers and was coaxing its end under the bouquet's binding. The large shears lay, not where they had been, but a hand's breadth to the left. I beg your pardon, Vale said quickly, without turning. The ribbon was fraying. It spoils the line. I thought... He stopped. The ribbon had been retied. Alleyn saw the knot lay reversed to its earlier set, the tails shorter. The bow, the house drew itself in, as grand houses do when confronted by the unadmitted. Doors softened their closes. The fire in the library withdrew to a courteous glow. Alleyn, who knew the music of these retreats, stood for a moment in the passage and listened to the small arrangements of silence. Somewhere a clock, thoughtful of its own importance, measured the hour with a fastidious tick. Fox returned from a discreet circuit. "All where you put them, sir," he murmured. Guests settled. Dr. Pemberton will telephone in the morning. The local station has men outside. "Thank you," said Alleyn. He was conscious of Troy's quiet presence at the far end of the corridor, speaking low to Helena Etheridge. "Bed, if you can manage it," he had suggested, and Troy had contrived it without fuss. Helena's face had the transparent look of a portrait under varnish, everything visible and yet held back. They moved toward the conservatory. The paper roses received them without comment. The single real bloom, grown looser in its beauty, had let another petal slip upon the cloth. Ellison stood just within the threshold with that particular impassivity which in butlers is half discretion, half fatigue. When Alleyn paused, Ellison's gaze rested, almost imperceptibly, upon the central plinth and then returned to exact neutrality, as if a word had reached the almost of his tongue and gone obediently back again. "The window catch was left as you set it?" Alleyn asked gently. "Yes, sir." Ellison's voice preserved the privacy of the house. "The draughts here, sir, are particular." The faintest taint of something medicinal drifted from the coffee cup on its saucer, now under a glass cloche, at Fox's suggestion. The arrangement of tools remained punctilious. Shears, bone folder, wire. Alleyn's eye lingered on the silk ribbon binding the bouquet. A bow retied, perhaps. No, he would not be emphatic. He stored the impression as one pockets a card for later. A small coughing sound, very soft and anxious, came from the morning room beyond the library. Fox's glance flicked. Alleyn inclined his head. They crossed the threshold to find Miss Pike with a brass scuttle and a pair of tongs, her back as straight as her hairpins. The waste paper basket beside the little writing table gave off a thread of smoke so thin it seemed almost a rumor of itself. "Oh," she said, composed, guilty only in the manner of servants who have been discovered doing something they ought not to do when important persons happen to be observing. "Forgive me, Inspector. I was disposing of memoranda. Lady Honoria said were no longer required." Alleyn looked at the fire. It had taken greedily. He watched the ash fold inward with the decorum of lace. "May I?" he asked, and without waiting, used the tongs to lift a sliver of paper that had fallen short of the flame. The scrap presented itself with fastidious reluctance. Cream, heavy, a faint watermark, and the ghost, still legible, of Lady Honoria's coronet. In an angular hand that seemed to write with the intention of being quoted later, 2 phrases had escaped annihilation: "after coffee" and "by the bouquet." Between them, a scorch had made a discretion of whatever connected the thoughts. Miss Pike's pencil tapped once against her cuff, and was still. "I quite thought it was one of Miss Helena's old dance cards," she said with careful vagueness. "They accumulate." Lady Honoria entered on the last word, composed with effort. "Araminta," she said, and then, seeing the tongs and the scrap, became formal. "Inspector, you must think us a parcel of melodramatists." I asked Miss Pike to clear the side table. "The morning room gathers litter. If anything of consequence has been harmed, I will accept the blame." "It is nothing conclusive," Alleyn said, and meant it. He folded the remnant into Fox's envelope. "One wonders, that is all." Sir Julian, who had been coaxed to the doorway by the magnetism of events, produced a small, dry smile. "One always does," he murmured. "It is the human condition." A very quiet movement at the window drew Alleyn's eye. Mr. Vale stood there, not intruding, his hands half closed against themselves. "I use that stationery," he said simply. "Lady Honoria allows me. It is kept in that drawer." He indicated the writing table, and in doing so looked at Miss Pike, not with accusation exactly, but with the helplessness of a man who has mislaid, before witnesses, something intimate. Miss Pike, unshaken, answered the look with level propriety. "The drawer is not locked," she said. "We write what must be written." The brigadier's voice, from somewhere behind them, supplied the soldier's corrective. "And destroy what must be destroyed. Sensible in war, less so in drawing rooms." Alleyn felt the balance of the evening tilt by the weight of a feather. It was not proof. It was not even a clue in the comfortable sense. It was, rather, a stirring, an admission that somewhere among these persons a message had been sent and wished unsent. He found, as often, that his understanding moved not by leaps, but by the arrangement of small silences into meaning. In the conservatory, the last petal loosened and fell with an unhearable softness. The paper roses, impeccable, undying, held their poses. Fox, folding the envelope, met Alleyn's glance with assent. Tomorrow would require patience. Tonight it would be enough to let the ash cool and the quiet finish its work. By midnight, the house had composed itself into a semblance of order, as houses of that sort will. The orchestra had been dismissed with sovereign tact. Doors that had stood hospitably ajar were set to a considerate, muffling narrowness. Coals breathed in their polished cages. The conservatory, bereft of voices, returned to its manufactured spring. Alleyn moved through it with a kind of unhurried exactness, not touching, rarely pausing, allowing the place to speak in its small, resilient murmurs. Dallow's chair had been discreetly removed to a back passage. The plinth remained, the paper roses preserved in their perpetual bloom. The real rose at the center had given up still more of itself. Its loosened petals lay like soft punctuation upon the cloth. Alleyn studied the ribbon that bound the bouquet. It was silk, good, a little stiff from handling. The bow sat slightly awry. One loop showed a twist that bespoke an impatient knotter, or perhaps merely a left-handed one. He put that small observation to rest beside many others. He had been thinking, with a slow, settling inevitability, of routines. Ellison's movements had the controlled grace of a litany. The coffee service had been marshaled as precisely as a parade. Cups from the second service, spode, the Sèvres retired on Miss Pike's advice. Sugar arranged in lumps, Lady Honoria's house disliked bowls of crystals and spoons aligned with their handles at a formal angle. The critic's cup had borne a minute, comprehensible, ring on its saucer and the faintest dark scurf where coffee had cooled. Nothing that shouted, everything that suggested. In the library earlier, Fox had found what Alleyn expected him to find and had said little about it. The small inevitabilities of a life interrupted. A penciled note in Dallow's pocket, 2 adjectives testing themselves against Mr. Vale's whites, no more. No angry letter. No florid threat. The disturbance of the evening had come, instead, in those quiet perturbations that meant more. The short interlude when Ellison could not be found because he had been attending to the telephone. The momentary displacement of the bone folder from the conservatory table, gone and then, absurdly, restored. The careless, almost domestic note that arrived for Sir Julian and proved to be no more than a muddle about a rehearsal call. Trifles. Yet trifles in company have their own fellowship. Alleyn stood by the paste dish. A thin skin had formed and been broken. The crossed brushes had been meticulously recrossed. He remembered Mr. Vale's careful, almost priestly handling of tools and Miss Pike's deftness with the small necessities of her mistress's life. He remembered, too, the butler's adjustment of the window catch earlier in the evening, how exact it had been, and the faint current of cooler air that had followed, bearing with it now only the odor of damp greenery and starch. Of cyanide, there remained merely the ghost of suggestion, the memory of almond where no perfume had been used. He turned from things to people, which was, in his experience, the sounder course. Dallow's talent had not been kindness. His candor, admired by readers, had bitten flesh this evening. Mr. Vale had seemed to fold into himself like paper too thin to bear a crease. Sir Julian had fenced with civility and known he had not entirely carried the bout. Lady Honoria, confronted with the possibility that her curated evening would enter the world transfigured into scandal, had exerted the profound force of management. The diamond at her throat trembled when she believed nobody looked. Helena's lip had been bitten to blood. The brigadier had brought an old soldier's contempt for cleverness without discipline. And Miss Pike had been scrupulous, obedient to a code not published in social papers, the code of essential people who make the lives of splendid people possible. He thought of loyalty then, that treacherous virtue. It dresses itself well, behaves properly, employs the best silver, and, when pressed beyond endurance, commits acts it afterwards cannot reconcile with its own conception of duty. He had seen it in theatres and in messes, at country lunches and in shabby digs near stations. Loyalty to a person, to a house, to an idea of what must not be allowed to happen. He allowed, too, for error. Murder rarely appears immaculate. The ribbon's telltale twist, the recrossed brushes, the displaced folder, the cup not of choice but of substitution. These were not the arrangements of a master mind, but the traces of someone working within timetables and expectations, fitting an offense into the narrow interstices of ritual. It was the ritual, in the end, that had betrayed them. The act had been made to look like a gesture toward the roses, and yet the roses, for all their eloquence, were a decoy. Coffee, not art, had done the essential work. The art had merely lent the evening its metaphor. Alleyn glanced toward the long windows and saw, reflected faintly, his own figure and, beyond it, the shadowy superimposition of the drawing-room, where the guests had been persuaded to go to bed or, failing that, to be quiet. He felt, as he sometimes did, the solution arrive at him like dust after the fall of something heavy. Not in a rush, but in a slow, even settling upon the surfaces of his mind until contours emerged. He would not yet speak it. To do so too soon would be to mistake understanding for proof and psychology for justice. There remained to be asked a small question about a telephone call, a shorter one about a spoon, and a very quiet one about a knot. Then, perhaps in the morning, in that room where civility reigns and truth occasionally finds it convenient to appear, he might invite them to sit and listen. By midnight, the house had composed itself into something like order. Doors were half closed in the old manor, the fire in the library had gentled its color, and Ellison's footfall, discreet as dust, passed and was gone. At Alleyn's request, the company gathered once more, not in alarm, but with that cultivated stillness by which they signified both self-command and curiosity. Lady Honoria took her accustomed throne-like chair. Sir Julian leaned an elegant elbow on the mantel-shelf. The brigadier stood as if the hearth-rug were a parade ground. Mr. Vale remained a little apart, his hands collapsed together as if they were a folded thing. Helena, grave now, had chosen a low seat near Troy and looked with a younger woman's candor from face to face. Miss Pike, neat as a pin and as easily overlooked, occupied the shadow just beyond the lamp's reach. "I shall not detain you," Alleyn said, and made it sound the lightest of assurances. "Dr. Pemberton will, in due course, speak to the necessary formalities. We, meanwhile, have our small matter of household arrangements." He let the phrase settle. The room listened. "Mr. Dallow died quickly," he went on, "and, I think, with the smoothness of an operation long rehearsed. Such effects are seldom achieved without knowledge of a habit. It is remarkable how closely our comforts instruct those who watch us. The ritual of coffee, for instance." The tiniest stir passed between Lady Honoria and Ellison. Nothing moved in their faces. "In this house," Alleyn said, "coffee follows a pattern. Cups counted, spoons laid, sugar set out, though two of your guests, Mr. Dallow among them, were known to take their coffee plain. Tonight, for 10 minutes, the little silver canister lost its place and presently regained it in the anteroom. A small fact, but facts are most talkative when they believe themselves too minor to be questioned." Sir Julian smiled in his eyes, not his mouth. The brigadier made a sound that could have been assent. Mr. Vale looked at his hands as if they had spoken without him. "There was also," Alleyn continued still in that conversational tone, "a note in Mr. Dallow's inner pocket. 'Half-past in the conservatory. See the truth of the roses.' It is typed on Lady Honoria's notepaper. The letters E and R have a faint burr, peculiar to a particular machine." Miss Pike did not move. In the small pause, Helena's breath escaped with a child's softness. "I'm obliged," Lady Honoria said frostily, "to my secretary for her diligence. If she has been the means of facilitating your inquiries, Inspector, she will be pleased." "Miss Pike's diligence is very much in point," Alleyn said. "We require it again for a small reconstruction in the morning. Tonight I ask only that you all keep to your rooms. Mr. Fox will see to the doors. It is nothing dramatic." He inclined his head and made of discipline an amenity. Merely a preference for tidiness. He let them go with quiet courtesies. Sir Julian murmured something deft and empty. The brigadier saluted gravity with a nod. Mr. Vale, passing Troy, lifted his eyes and managed the ghost of gratitude. Lady Honoria's hand, briefly, rested upon Miss Pike's sleeve and withdrew with exact neutrality. When the door had closed on the last of them, Alleyn said, "Miss Pike, if you please." She came at once, as if to an appointment. In the quieter light, she looked very nearly pretty, which was perhaps not her wish, for it made her more visible. "You changed the cracked cup," Alleyn began, "and removed the hairline offender from service. An excellent routine. You also corrected the place cards when Lady Honoria altered the order after 5 o'clock, and you repaired a slipped ribbon on the central bouquet at 7. He spoke without emphasis. "You are, if I may say so, the keeper of the household's margins." Her hands, very still, lay one upon the other. "It is my employment to notice the edges," she said. "Of course. The note in Mr. Dallow's pocket. How does your machine treat its E and R?" "The machine belongs to Lady Honoria," she returned, and after the beat due to propriety, added, "The burr has been present for some weeks." "And the silver canister?" "I left the drawing room to set right a mislaid program," a fractional lift of the chin. "The coffee inspector is Ellison's province." "Certainly," Alleyn agreed. "And yet, when a house runs as soundlessly as this one, its slightest change is loud." He allowed the line to rest. "There is one other point. Mr. Vale's tools seemed freshly set in order. Was the shears place altered tonight?" "I returned them to their tray after Lady Honoria, in her enthusiasm, displaced them. Was an exhibition piece. Sir Julian might, I thought, reach for demonstration." She had answered everything and admitted nothing. It was not defiance, but a kind of chastity. "Miss Pike," Alleyn said, and his voice was almost kind, "in the morning I shall ask you to indulge me with a short experiment. You will not find it offensive. Meanwhile, do not burn drafts or tidy more than your conscience requires." For the first time, something like color touched her cheek. "I understand." "Good night," said Alleyn. When she had gone, he stood a moment longer, listening to the house. Somewhere, faintly, a petal gave way and found its place among its paper companions. The hour had that flavor of truth deferred which is the last civility before daylight. Alleyn asked for the morning room, whose pale walls and orderly desk suited the kind of disclosure that has no need of audience. Lady Honoria sat very straight on a fragile chair that had withstood more than fashion, her hands composed in her lap. Mr. Vale stood a little apart, as if fearing to touch anything lest it bruise. Miss Pike came last, closing the door as unobtrusively as one files a letter. "I should like to set out what we have learned," Alleyn said, the words arranged with the care he gave to such recitals. "Not to harrow anyone, but to put the matter on its feet." He began, as he must, with the cup. The spode bore a new chip. Within the fracture were crystals that answered to cyanide. The rim was turned inward when it was set down, guiding the first sip. He spoke of the pivot of the shears with its faint crust, of paste dish and bone folder showing impressions smaller than Mr. Vale's, of the punctured stem of the living rose. "Laurel water," he said gently. "One may make it from the cherry laurel leaves in your garden, Lady Honoria. It leaves an almond ghost. A green fragment from such a leaf was caught in the torn base of a white bloom where something had been hurriedly introduced and withdrawn." No one moved. The fire in the little grate made its discreet confidences. "The forged letter invited Mr. Dallow to privacy after coffee," Alleyn continued. "It was written on your paper and typed on your machine. That points, I'm afraid, to the office in your study. Miss Pike has stewardship of both. She also discovered, with her excellent eye, the crack in Mr. Dallow's preferred Sèvres cup, obliging the substitution." Lady Honoria, without looking up, said, "Araminta." Miss Pike did not answer at once. She had that particular stillness of one who has taken an examination and now, hearing the invigilator gather the papers, puts down her pencil. The faintest color came and went in her cheeks. "One other thing," Alleyn said. "Miss Etheridge overheard a woman pleading yesterday afternoon, pleading for mercy that would not wound a career. She could not name the voice, but she remembered by chance the punctuation of a habit." Alleyn's eyes went to the slim pencil in Miss Pike's cuff. A gentle tap between phrases. "You do it now and then, Miss Pike." Miss Pike looked at her hands, which lay composed upon the desk's edge. "I did not think anyone would notice that," she said, very quietly. Mr. Vale made a small, strangled sound. "Araminta, no." She lifted a hand, not to silence him, but in a gesture that expressed more of apology than of defense. "I typed the letter," she said. "I used Lady Honoria's paper. Mr. Dallow would not see me, not really. When I went to him yesterday, I asked only that he consider the weight of what he meant to do. He told me cruelty is the critic's last honesty, and that sentiment was the ruin of art." Her mouth trembled and she steadied it, I'm not an artist. I'm a servant. I thought sentiment my only weapon. Alleyn waited. It was his experience that, once begun, such statements concluded themselves. I made the laurel water last week, Miss Pike went on, as if reciting a schedule. I had read of it. I thought if the room carried that fragrance, no one would question it, should anyone notice at all. I chipped the spode with the shears and smeared the liquid within. I turned the cup. I pricked the rose to lend its breath. I did not mean it to be theatrical. She closed her eyes briefly. I meant it to be unnoticed. Lady Honoria turned her head then, and the movement had in it something like fatigue. "Oh, Araminta," she said, and there was in the address less reproach than sorrow. "For a review." "For him," Miss Pike said, and it was not melodramatic. "He would not have borne it. He makes paper answer like skin. I saw what it cost him to make those petals speak. Mr. Dallow meant to strip him of voice and leave him in silence. I could not bear that." Mr. Vale had covered his face. Through his fingers, words emerged that were more breath than speech. "You cannot, on my account." "It was mine," she said with a sort of composed despair. "My wrong, not yours." Alleyn inclined his head, acknowledging both the confession and the curious dignity with which she offered it. "I'm obliged to ask," he said, "whether anyone helped you." "No," Miss Pike answered. "I've spent 7 years observing how to accomplish tasks without being seen. It appears I learned too well." There was a pause that altered the room. Outside, a gardener's barrow squeaked along the gravel, extraordinarily audible. Alleyn rose. "We shall do this quietly," he said. "There is procedure. Mr. Fox will attend to the formalities." He looked from Lady Honoria to Mr. Vale and back again. It need not be made a spectacle. Miss Pike stood, smoothing her skirt with a motion that had become, in this household, a kind of signature. "Thank you," she said, to none of them and to all. "I am very tired of spectacle." The paper roses, somewhere beyond the closed door, kept their unalterable poise. The household moved as if it had been instructed to breathe more softly. Morning had passed into that subdued afternoon in which the rumor of rain settles on London and never quite commits itself. The drawing-room, witness to so many correct conversations, now received a different sort of ceremony. Alleyn had asked for quiet, and it was given him. Miss Pike sat on the small settee beneath the Gainsborough, very straight and very composed. A faint colour had returned to her cheeks, as if a line once held too rigidly had at last released. Fox, grave and considerate, stood a little to one side with his notebook closed. He had the air of a man who knows that what needs to be said will be said without prompting. Lady Honoria, in the chair that was hers by custom and temperament, folded her hands and did not look at anyone. The diamonds at her throat had become, by some social alchemy, inappropriate. When she did speak, it was to Alleyn, and with the dry precision of a woman who had agreed, for the first time in many years, to yield the conduct of her house to another. "Inspector, I ask only that this be done without spectacle." "It shall," Alleyn said. Miss Pike's eyes moved to him then, grey, very clear, and oddly apologetic. "I've written a statement," she said. "You will find it accurate." She glanced at the desk where her familiar machine sat, faithful to the end. "I typed it. That seems fitting." The room absorbed this with the same grave patience it had accorded the news of Mr. Dallow's death. Sir Julian, by the mantel, looked down and away. The brigadier's jaw tightened and then released, like a man giving a silent order to troops he respected. Helena stood near Troy with the particular stillness of youth confronting the shape of adult consequence. Troy's hand found the girl's for a moment and was quietly accepted. Peregrine Vale had taken a chair by the window where the pale light flattened his features into something almost abstract. He did not speak. The little movement of his fingers, a habitual folding and unfolding as of imagined paper, was the only sign of life. Miss Pike, Alleyn said, and his voice, for all its control, carried kindness. There will be certain formalities. Detective Inspector Fox will accompany you to the car. You may bring a coat. She nodded. Thank you. Then, quite unexpectedly, she looked at Lady Honoria. I'm sorry, she said, not with sentiment, but with a precision that made the words heavier. I have served your house imperfectly. Lady Honoria's control held, but only just. You have served it exceedingly well, she replied, until you did not. Miss Pike inclined her head as if accepting a just correction. To Vale she offered nothing so compromising as a glance, yet after a small, almost imperceptible pause, she said, Mr. Vale, do not abandon the white ones. They were true. It was all, and it was too much. He made a small sound, half breath, half protest, and then was silent again. Fox stepped forward with the gentle certainty that had won him confidences from rough men and frightened children. He helped Miss Pike into her coat as if he were handing her a file from a clerk's tray. No handcuffs, no raised voices. The door closed upon them with the quietness reserved in good houses for funerals and important secrets. The stillness that followed was different. It had lost its panic. It had not yet found relief. Lady Honoria rose, and the room rose with her, as if by instinct. Inspector, she said, the police will require access as they must. Ellison will facilitate. I should be grateful if our guests could be permitted to leave tomorrow morning. That can be arranged. Sir Julian approached Alleyn with the bewildered dignity of a man who has played kings and cannot quite reconcile himself to the insolence of ordinary tragedy. Was it? Did she? He stopped. She made a thorough confession, Alleyn said quietly. The letter, the cup, the rose. She believed she was acting, how shall we put it, in the service of an ideal she could not argue into existence. Ah, Sir Julian murmured. Art's small martyrdoms, translated. The brigadier cleared his throat. Folly, of course, he said, not unkindly. But one recognizes devotion when one sees it. Damnable, the uses to which it can be put. Helena, after an anxious glance at Lady Honoria, ventured, will she? Must it be very public? We shall avoid what can be avoided, Alleyn said. There will be an inquest. There must be. But a matter can be conducted with dignity when those concerned make it so. Lady Honoria inclined her head. We shall oblige. It was then that Vale rose at last and, with a diffident motion, addressed Alleyn without quite meeting his eyes. Inspector, might I take down the arrangement? The paper flowers, I mean. I thought, perhaps. Not tonight, Alleyn said gently. Tomorrow the police photographer will have finished. After that, I think Lady Honoria will not object. Lady Honoria said, it has served its purpose, which, in another world, would have been a compliment, and in this one, was a benediction. The afternoon dimmed itself another degree. Somewhere in the distance a taxi sounded its horn with urban irony. Within, the company dispersed by inches. They did not speak of what came next. It came without their speech. Justice, such as it was, had set its hand upon the matter and would proceed at its customary pace. What remained for the house was to reclaim its breath, and for those within it to learn, each in private, what silence could and could not forgive. A week after the verdict, London resumed its usual indifference. Newspapers folded their interest into the inside pages. The theatre columns found new quarrels, and the fashion of paper roses turned briefly modish, then faded. Alleyn returned to Lady Honoria's house at her request, more to close a chapter than to reopen it. The conservatory was quieter than he remembered, bereaved of its drama, as rooms sometimes are when the actors have gone. Ellison conducted him with that extra shade of gravity that permanence gives to service. The central plinth stood bare. The paper roses had been removed, boxed, and sent on to a modest gallery that had offered to keep them intact, as Miss Pike had asked. Only the glass dome remained, polished to a fiercer clarity than glass can usually bear. The single real rose, now a tidied absence, had left a faint, rust-colored petal mark upon the linen, a small, indelible courtesy from the truth. Lady Honoria entered with deliberate composure. She looked older, but almost gratefully so, as if time had stepped in to share a burden. "Inspector," she said, "I wish to thank you for your manner. It matters, you know. In the end, it matters very much." "It costs nothing," he said, "and sometimes pays." She gave a small smile. "In the servants' hall, they say you listen more than you speak. I have at last learned the value of that accomplishment." They stood for a time without aim. The winter light fell flatly upon the tiled floor. The trellis, stripped of its imitation riot, looked suddenly honest in its skeletal way. The house sounded like itself again. Footsteps above, a subdued whisper of coal, the exact distance between bell and answer. "You will have heard," Lady Honoria went on, "that Mr. Vale has taken a studio in Fitzrovia. Something small. He wrote to say he needs to learn the difference between delicacy and weakness. I imagine that is a lifetime's curriculum." "Troy says delicacy is a strength if one permits it to risk itself," Alleyn said. "Troy is wise," Lady Honoria replied, and allowed the name its familiar shelter. "Miss Pike has written to me. She asked for nothing but news of the household, and whether Ellison still forgets the second bell on Tuesdays. She remembers, you see, the tiny inaccuracies that make up the shape of a life." Ellison, at a tactful distance, adjusted a blind with a precision that made any further comment unnecessary. In that small act lay a whole biography of loyalty and caution. Sir Julian had sent flowers on the day of the sentencing, white chrysanthemums with a card of immaculate restraint. The brigadier had left a calling card edged in black, as if mourning procedure could be recruited to restore order. Helena Etheridge had written Troy a cramped, earnest note about the terror of grown-up feelings, and had received in reply a page of kindness that spoke of weathering rather than solving. "Do you ever grow used to it?" Lady Honoria asked after a moment. The clean edge of an idea turned to an instrument, the transfiguration of good manners into silence. "No," Alleyn said. "One grows practiced. It is not the same thing." They walked once round the conservatory, as if circling the perimeter of a memory. At the door, Lady Honoria paused. "I shall not give another exhibition for a time. One must learn to entertain the living without summoning symbols and consequences." She looked towards the plinth. Still, the roses did their work. They taught me that an arrangement is a declaration, however one pretends otherwise. Outside, the afternoon had taken on that London quality of light that makes stone appear thoughtful. Troy waited by the car, her scarf tucked in the way he liked. She had been sketching the conservatory roof lines on the back of an envelope. The pencil left its provisional authority upon the paper. "Well?" she asked as they drove away. "Will you tell me what you think of it all, as a composition?" "It was beautifully made," he said. "Too beautifully. The flaw had to be the truth." "The real Rose," she murmured. "I said it was the only honest thing in the room." "It was," he agreed, "and it killed a man. Honesty does that now and then when someone decides to manage it." They crossed the park, where the trees wrote their signatures against a pale sky. Troy tucked her arm through his in the easy way that made rooms and questions rearrange themselves tolerably. He thought of Miss Pike's tidy notebook, of Vale's careful hands, of Dallow's poised pen, of Lady Honoria's diamonds adjusted like punctuation. Paper, he reflected, remembers every fold, even when it is smoothed. Roses remember each touch, even when they are made of air and patience. At the corner, he said, more to the window than to Troy, "We mistake silence for kindness and arrangement for mercy. But the kindest thing is sometimes to let the real light in, however it looks on the furniture." And the paper roses? Troy asked. They will last, he said. That is their virtue and their warning. The car moved on. Behind them, a house resumed its breathing. Ahead, the city unscrolled its indifferent, consoling streets.